Oh, it's so fun, isn't it? It's fun. Last week it was Chicago. This week it's who was the band that did that? Civil Wars. That's right. Yeah, Civil Wars and Irish Dement. It's so much fun to be here and have this great music. And I'll get into a little bit about that, about the music and some other thoughts here, and with regard to just what we do in here as we think today about this part of our series. This series, Living on Purpose: 6 Practices for Life. And just to recap last week, as I introduced this idea, living on purpose, living intentionally, you look at the root of those two words, and the idea is that it's not like we're setting a goal. This is not about goal setting. This is not about completing resolutions. Certainly that we have purposes, we have goals, we have things we want to accomplish, but living on purpose, especially as people of faith, is something else entirely, and it's something our world is desperately lacking. It's living with this sense of stretching into things, of opening up to things. The root word of purpose, the root word of intention is to open and to stretch. It's not in the sense of to completion, it's simply in the sense of being in that mode of being that way as we journey through life. Hence the reason why we sent that card out as well. I love that Rilke quote, things that have never been, and yet so much possibility exists when we're present to God in the midst of our life, to the ground of our being in that way. So that's the overall idea. What are some practices that might empower us, might help us, might enable us in doing that? And so I've got some ideas, and there are, of course, many, perhaps spiritual practices and whatnot that you might be aware of and already participating in. But the first one we started with was this idea of saying yes. Simply this idea of opening to the journey, of saying yes. Especially, not so much optimism, but more this openness, this excitement about what's possible, that something bigger than us is possible. In a world that seems to be constricting and saying less and less is, and less matters, and fewer people matter. And so in that reality, saying yes is quite a bold statement. And today I want to think with you about generosity, open hearts, open minds, open doors. Some of you might remember this phrase as the Methodist caption, the Methodist logo and slogan for a number of years. It was the national, international slogan for our church. It created some conflicts over the last 15 years, I guess, 10 to 15 years, because in some ways our doors were not always open, and the church is struggling with that right now, with this understanding of who are we in the midst of sexual identity and sexual politics and conflict and gender identity. Who are we in that regard? And so this open mind, open hearts, open doors is a little more troubling. It does remain the slogan for a number of conferences still, quite a few conferences around the U.S., the North Texas over in Dallas, that one, and a number of others all over the U.S. and outside of the U.S. But I love the concept behind this slogan. And while the slogan these are the words of the slogan, this is not necessarily what I was going for. I really am wanting to think with you about what the nature of generosity is. And so I have a couple of thoughts about that. I want to start with this idea of what it means to be generous. And I read this story a while back about a guy named Elias Zakov. Elias Zakov is an Israeli soldier, a commander. He was a tank commander in the military for a number of years, and then about 15 years ago retired and took over the International Youth Organization in Israel. And he tells this story of how he had been on duty with his tanks and with the soldiers under him, the squadron under him, and his commander had come to him and told him that he wanted to visit with him. And so he took him out to a remote area away from where the post was and where there was a field of sort of just this dry ground and sand. And he told him to grab up a handful of sand. So Eliav grabbed up a handful of sand, and then he had said, now grab up another handful of sand. So he grabbed up a second. He said, okay, now open your left hand, and he opened the left hand. And then the commander reached down and he took some more sand and he put it in that left hand. He says, continue, hold that one open. And then he said, now I want you to clench your right hand as tight as you can. Well, you know what happened. As soon as he started clenching the right hand, the sand began to seep out. There was some quite a bit that was still in there. But as he looked at his left hand, looked at his right hand, the commander looked at him and said, "Which hand is holding more?" Well, obviously, the open hand. Now, his commander might have been trying to make some kind of comment with regard to the politics going on in the Middle East at the time, still continuous to this day. That this seems to be continuing around the world, how we try to cling by putting up borders, or how we try to define property, whose is whose and what is whose. And in reality, the more we cling to something, the more we lose in the process. We do this with our kids at kindergarten, right? We tell our kids, share. Sharing is so much more rewarding because we participate in other people's stuff, but not just their stuff. We participate in their lives as they share their stuff. I mean, it's so much richer to have open hands than it is to have closed hands, but that's the way of the way. He could have been speaking about that, but Eliav says that there's something else that occurred to him. He said that he realized that people chronically are closed to others, and as a result, the rest of the world suffers. That generosity is a way of being in the world, not a way of giving. And so what I want to think with you is this idea of generosity, that it has little to do with giving gifts. Charity, generosity, I'm sure, I don't want you to stop giving to the church. Generosity, don't start thinking of it as giving, because it's too easy to clench your fist. If we give a little, we hold back some. If we give a little, we hold back some. Just in our life in general, right? We protect ourselves with people we like. We protect ourselves with people we understand or that we think understand us, and that's where we draw the line. Generosity is not about defining or partitioning or sharing just a bit. Generosity is a whole other way of looking at life. Generosity has to do with giving space. If you look at the root word of generosity, it's rooted in the same word as grace. Generosity is about favor. It's about favoring. It's about giving space to others to be who they are. To live generously is to live openly with others. John Wesley had this wonderful idea that first attracted me when I was in the fundamentalist church growing up as a teenager. And I didn't grow up in the church much as a kid. I was Episcopalian, and I had very little involvement in the church in San Antonio, and then here in Fort Worth when we moved here. But I got very involved in the Baptist church as a young teenager, and then into the Bible church, and was headed off to Wheaton College in Illinois, and then to Fuller, and I had the whole lineup that I was going to pursue. But I went instead, for some reason, I went to well, first of all, I started dating my wife, and she was Methodist, and I was totally unfamiliar with Methodism. But her understanding, of course, was she had a deep understanding of that tradition. She grew up in that tradition, but still, this idea of kind of the Bible church and the rigidity of doctrine and such, that was a little repulsive to her, a little bit off-putting to her. Repulsive may be too strong a word, I don't know, but she probably would say no. But it was not strong enough word, she'd probably say. But we went off to college at UT, and we were involved in InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, and then we started participating in the Methodist Church there locally. And as we did, something started to open up for me. This whole idea, as we were in the 70s, and mid-70s to mid to late 70s, and we were looking at struggles with identity, we were looking at group struggle within the campus setting, we were looking at political struggle outside of the campus, and I just started realizing there's something not being addressed when we define ourselves as opposed to others. And I couldn't put it into words, but John Wesley had this idea that struck me as amazing, this idea of what is called prevenient grace, this notion that we rest in the grace of God regardless of who or where or how we are. We are just given. The way Paul Tillich said it, the theologian Paul Tillich, he said, we are accepted. We are simply accepted. The most difficult thing we have in life is to accept our acceptance. That's the most challenging thing for us, it seems. John Wesley said, God's grace is already there. It's already working in us. It's already inspiring, motivating, moving us to realize something much deeper and to open up to that and accept it for ourselves, so to speak. This idea that we're already all there was a revelation to me. And so I began to pursue Wesleyanism more. And I think there's something of that in our text this morning. Let's see if I could borrow a bulletin here, just to review this text with you again. I think there's something of that. There's so much in this text that was totally unintended, right? I mean, I love this part. Philip goes off to Nathanael and says, "We found the Messiah. He's from Nazareth." And Nathanael says, "Nothing good comes from Nazareth." I didn't know anybody was going to act like that this week. Wasn't in there at all. But the reality is that's the way we are sometimes. We make judgment calls about other people. Sometimes it's really harsh. Other times we just do it in passing, just by the way we look at one another. Sometimes I do it when I think about a small town. I really don't want to go to that town. Can't be anything good in that little town. You ever been to Muleshoe? It turns out it's a great town. Who would have thunk it? They hold the annual International World Championship of Muleshoe tossing, which is really cool. It's a great town. It's a wonderful community. I've performed at schools out there and had some of the best time. The reality is, anywhere you go, you will find that kind of person that you can relate to. The problem is, it requires generosity, right? It requires that open hand as opposed to the clenched fist. And so, Nathanael says, there's nothing that good that can come out of Nazareth. And already Jesus has provided his first lesson. But I like this other thing that he says. He says, "I saw you under the fig tree." It reminds me of that great scene in Avatar, where the female character, and I don't remember her name, the female avatar looks at the soldier, and she looks into his eyes, and she says, "I see you." And he looks back into her eyes, and he says, "I see you." And we understand immediately what that means. It's like namaste. It's like, I see the Christ in you, and you see the Christ in me. It's that kind of "I see you." And he says, "I saw you under the fig tree." And then Nathanael says, "It's like you know me. It's like, I believe. I accept who you say you are." And then Jesus is saying, you do that just because I said I saw you. And yet you're going to see a whole lot. Now, our tendency to think here is that Jesus is talking about, I'm going to do miracles. It's going to be the best magic show you ever saw. I'm going to turn water into wine. I'm going to resurrect people. You're going to love it. That's not the kind of wonder stuff, right? That doesn't change anybody's mind. If that was the case, we'd have a bunch of Lazarites walking around. Lazarus raised from the dead. We don't see a whole bunch of Lazarites walking around. The fact is that's not what he was talking about. I think what Jesus was talking about there is, I'm going to blow your mind, and I'm probably going to piss you off, and you're going to see things completely differently, because the Samaritans they belong here, because the Gentiles, they belong here, because the tax collectors, they belong here. I'm going to show you things you've never seen. The words he uses, heaven's going to open up. What a wonderful image. Open doors. So I love that text. It says so much more than I think we realize. Martin Luther King had this wonderful quote in here that I wanted to make sure you all saw. We've already heard several this morning. I think he had some idea of what I'm talking about here this morning, about this idea of generosity is not simply a way of giving. It's a way of being in the world that is open to others, to give space to everyone to become who they are. And so he has this quote, "You have not started living until you can rise above the narrow confines of your individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity." I think we believe that. But that's hard to put into action. We didn't talk about doing this song, Brad and Sherman and I, but it seemed to be appropriate for the day, and I rehearsed it real quickly last night, so I hope I remember how to do it. Let's make sure if I got volume here. Am I on? I won't do it if it... Are we on? We're turned on? Yeah. got the volume up. It's quite possible the battery died. Brad, can I borrow your guitar? Well, okay. If I gotta play Brad's guitar. Here, thank you. I'll do that this way. We should have done a little sound check maybe right before the service began. I guess we didn't get to that part. I just wanted to play Brad's guitar. Okay, so we got the volume up. There we go. Martin Luther, who did you think that you were? Appointed by some higher up, merely mortal, your plans were unaffordable. No one wants to pay for love. Oh, you beautiful fool, swimming upstream and kicking up waves. Dreams weren't meant to come true. That's why they call them dreams. Oh, you beautiful fool. Walter Cronkite preempted Disney one night, and all us kids were so upset. We thought that you were a trouble instigator, marching through our TV set. Oh, you beautiful fool, swimming upstream and kicking up waves. Dreams weren't meant to come true. That's why they call them dreams. Oh, you beautiful fool. To fight a fight without a fist, all human knowledge resists this. How dare you threaten our existence? Mahatma Gandhi, Jesus Christ, history repeats itself so nice. Clearly we are resistant to love. I saw you one night on the TV, surrounded by blacks and whites all around you. I saw you on another night without a sign of life in you. Oh, you beautiful fool, swimming upstream and kicking up waves. Dreams weren't meant to come true. That's why they call them dreams. Oh, you beautiful fool. Oh, you beautiful fool. I read an article, and we'll close with this idea with you. I read an article by Rabbi Shapiro in Health and Spirituality and Health magazine. It was a response to something that a writer, a professor named Dr. Lacera, her name is Elena Lacera, and she was writing about relationships in this article in Health magazine, Spirituality and Health. She said, relationships don't have a chance to exist. Here's the reason why relationships have so much trouble. The odds are against relationships. And she spoke about sort of the physicality of relationships. She spoke about the biology of relationships and the neurobiology of relationships and how difficult it is to move beyond our emotions when in relationships. And so the challenge will have to work with others to create a wider network of support that supports this idea of staying together, she said. So a very physical sort of systematic look at how our relationships work. And so Rabbi Shapiro wrote a response to it that was really fascinating. And he said he wanted to give an assessment of the human condition with regard to relationships. And this is what he said. He said, here's my fearless assessment of humanity and why relationships don't work. We suck. We suck. He said we don't agree with it. We won't receive it. We won't accept it. But it's true. We suck. He said, look at the 7 things God detests in Proverbs 6. Pride, dishonesty, murder, mischief, false witness, sowing discord. We suck. We do this. In various degrees, we do these things, and some in much larger degrees. He said, look at Dante's 7 deadly sins in comparison to our 21st century. Lust, gluttony, greed, discouragement, wrath, envy, pride. Pretty much pegs humanity, he says. And most of, or if not all, but many of our role models, and now we know in our media, not just in our politics, we suck. He said, in short, because we look out for number 1, pretty much at the expense of number 2 through infinity, relationships are difficult. But all relationships are. Now, according to Dr. Lacera, she says that we think it's in our best interest to do these things, to think about ourselves, and the best interest of those we love to do so. So even when we give to charity, for many people, it's still out of that sense of obligation. It's still out of that sense of we're doing it sort of for us. It's some kind of a cognitive dissonance, some kind of subconsciousness, she says, that we do this. Most people don't want to admit the inescapable selfishness of our human nature, and so we never really change. Imagine, he said, for example, Shapiro said, if the U.S., the most Christian nation in the industrialized world, actually took Jesus seriously, would we live in a country where 1% of the population controls 40% of the wealth? Where millions of Americans live below the poverty line. Would we be that way if we followed Jesus? And then he quoted a theologian, a progressive theologian, and he said this. He said, we couldn't stand Jesus, so we invented Christianity. Nobody's leaving yet. Okay. It's a little hard. It's painful. It is. But here's the thing. What Shapiro says, and he's a good, devout Jewish rabbi, a very progressive rabbi with a lot of connections with Christian ministers and theologians and respected by so many different faith traditions. He's saying this, and he says the challenge is, the reason why we have to come to terms with this, with the fact that we suck, is because otherwise we're not going to change until we come to terms with the reality of who we are. There's part of our human nature to clench our fists. It's much more difficult to walk around with open hands. It's difficult. So the real question is, how are we going to change this general sense of suckiness? And one of the things that he suggests that I want to leave with you is this idea that we heard Martin Luther King say, this idea that we heard DeAndrea, I don't see DeAndrea right now, but we heard DeAndrea say in her opening words before the prayer, this idea that we heard in the song, sort of the antithesis of why this doesn't work. Why is it that love has such trouble succeeding? And I think it's because we got the wrong story. See, we think God is separate from us. We think we're separate from one another. So we kind of do a little bit, and assuage some guilt maybe, or participate a little bit. But if we realize just how connected we are. Take your lungs. Myself. You know the Leviticus text that says, love your neighbor as yourself. It doesn't say love your neighbor as you love yourself. And Jesus quotes it again and says, what's the great commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. Love your neighbor as yourself. It doesn't say love yourself, love your neighbor, love yourself. It says love your neighbor as yourself. I'm going to take that quite literally. Love your neighbor as yourself. So let's talk about ourselves for a minute, just physically. We take our lungs out, right? We need our lungs, but let's just take them out. Walk around with our lungs outside our body. Is it going to work? Not going to work, right? Need our lungs not just in the body, we need our lungs connected to the body. And not just that, we need to breathe the air. We can't live without oxygen. But let's go a little further. How do we get the oxygen? Trees, plants, grass. We need that to survive. Just as much as the trees are there to survive off of our own exchange of chemicals, so we are dependent on the trees. We are dependent on people who are involved in the trees and the planting. We're dependent on people who create farms for us, who create livestock, who watch farm and ranch livestock, and who provide vegetables. We are dependent on these. We are dependent on other countries and cultures. No one can say, Google cannot say, what's his name, Google? Bezos, Jeff Bezos. Jeff Bezos cannot say, I created Google. Right? He came up with the idea, but he needs billions of people to make it work. We are an interconnected reality. And we are as much dependent on one another as we are on our own bodies. At the very heart of who we are is this reality that we are connected with one another. And our stories need to reflect that. So I want to close with this thought. Why do we worship in the round?
To connect with one another.
To remind us and connect. Why do we have this welcome candle that we say, come whoever you are, it doesn't matter how many times you've broken your vow, because we're human, we're going to do that. We're going to clench our fists, we're going to break our vows, but we come together. We sit in the circle, we look at one another. And no, we don't talk enough with each other as we should. I would love to stop talking. You'd probably love for me to stop talking too. But I would love to stop talking. I would love for us just to talk with one another and every now and then raise our hand or look over at someone else and say, what do you think about this? It's what we do on Monday nights and at some of our other group gatherings. But this is why this is worship. Worship is remembering that we are connected and moving from this place into the world with hands that are open that begin to see people are connected there too. Where's the biggest community you have outside of this church? Do you know where it is? The freeway. Serious. It's the freeway. It's the freeway. Think of how rude you are on the freeway. Not even rude necessarily. You're just not connected, right? But that's the biggest community that we have outside of gatherings like this, which is to say two things. First, it's to say this is really important. This is important to be here because it's one of the few places we have large community and we are looking at one another and realizing we are part of this amazing creation. We are part of the ground of all being that we share with one another. It's not always comfortable, but this is what this is. But it's also encouraging to know that as we travel out there, out beyond and in the highways, maybe we can do something a little different as we look at those other cars around us. We are connected with them too. They are a part of this community we call life. What would that mean in terms of how we treat one another on the roads and in every other encounter that we have? My son and I used to see that guy that would stand on the freeway with a rainbow cap, and it was at Summit exit before the freeway was rebuilt and switched around and enlarged, and he would sit there almost every day, stood there with a big sign that said, beware, beware, you're going to meet God, you're about to meet God. And then he would go under the bridge, and he would disappear, and the whole west of Fort Worth would open up because you go under that bridge, that Summit exit bridge. And I used to think he was just the guy saying, yes, the end of the world is coming. But then I got to realize now, I look back on that and I suddenly realize he's John the Baptist. He's just reminding me. He's reminding all of us. Take a look around and meet God. Amen.